On a cold January afternoon in 2009, Captain Chesley Sullenberger radioed a simple, chilling message. "We hit birds, we lost thrust in both engines, we're turning back towards LaGuardia." In seconds, a routine flight had become a desperate glide over New York City. But what actually causes an engine to suddenly go silent? It's not a single rare catastrophe, it's a predictable interruption of the combustion process. Flameouts happen when the fire inside the engine is snuffed out, often by something as mundane as a bird, a cloud of ash, or an empty fuel tank. The key is that these events are rarely random. Birds follow migration routes, ash clouds drift on predictable winds, and fuel levels are measurable. Understanding the causes is the first step to surviving them, and as we'll see, pilots have more control than you might think. So what exactly is a flameout? At its core, it is a simple failure. The fire inside a jet engine goes out. A jet engine breathes air, compresses it, mixes it with fuel, and ignites the mixture in a continuous burn. When that burn stops, for any reason, thrust vanishes. The question is, what can snuff out a flame burning at over 1,000 degrees Celsius? One common culprit is a compressor stall. Inside the engine, spinning blades compress incoming air. If that airflow is disrupted by a sudden change in angle or a foreign object, the pressure can reverse violently. Pilots hear a loud bang and see flames shooting from the exhaust. It is not an explosion but a stall, a sneeze that can extinguish the fire. But a stall is just one trigger. The real danger is that a flameout is rarely the end of the story. Modern engines are built to relight, if conditions allow. The relight envelope defines the narrow window of altitude and airspeed where a restart is possible. Outside that envelope, the engine stays dead, and the aircraft becomes a glider. But what could possibly bring a modern jet engine to a halt? The answer often comes on feathered wings. Bird strikes are among the most common and sudden causes of flameouts. A collision that turns a flock of geese into a projectile barrage. On January 15, 2009, US Airways Flight 1549 climbed from LaGuardia at 2,800 feet when it met a flock of Canada geese. The impact silenced both engines. Captain Sullenberger radioed, "We hit birds. We lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia." The physics is brutal. A goose weighing several pounds striking a fan blade at over 200 miles per hour delivers a force comparable to a cannonball. The blades fracture, debris is ingested, and combustion stops. Not from fuel shortage, but from shattered geometry. The result is a sudden, total loss of thrust, exactly what Sullenberger faced. With no relight possible at such low altitude, his only option was to glide to a landing on the Hudson River. The miracle on the Hudson proved that even a catastrophic flameout can end safely with skill and luck. So what about the threat you cannot see? Volcanic ash drifts on high-altitude winds, invisible to radar, yet capable of turning a jet engine into a furnace of glass. On June 24, 1982, British Airways Flight 9 flew into a plume from Mount Galunggung. The ash melted inside the engines at 1,400 degrees Celsius, far above its melting point of 1,100 P, and fused into a glassy coating on the turbine blades. One by one, all four engines flamed out. Captain Eric Moody later recalled the cockpit windows had been sandblasted opaque. The aircraft became a glider at 37,000 feet, descending silently toward the Indian Ocean. Unlike a bird strike, which damages instantly, ash kills slowly. The glass coating disrupts airflow, chokes the combustion, and starves the flame. By the time the crew realized the threat, the engines were already dying. But bird strikes are not the only way an engine can be silenced. A more mundane, yet equally deadly cause lurks in the fuel tanks. So why do planes run out of fuel when every flight plan calculates the exact amount needed? The answer is almost always human error. A miscalculated fuel load, a forgotten transfer pump, or a leak that goes unnoticed. In 1995, a Boeing 750 flying from Miami to Cali ran out of fuel because the crew had not switched on the fuel cross-feed valves. The engines flamed out at 9,000 feet, which means that fuel starvation is not a mechanical failure, it is a failure of planning. And that is exactly why it is predictable. Every flight has a fuel plan, but when that plan is ignored or mismanaged, the result is a silent engine and a powerless descent. So when a flameout strikes, Is the engine truly dead? Not necessarily. Pilots have a second chance if they can reach the relight envelope. This is the narrow window of altitude and airspeed where a restart is possible, a lifeline that turns a powerless glide back into powered flight. But the envelope has strict limits. For a typical CFM56-7B engine, a restart is only possible below 30,000 feet and within a speed window of 100 to 250 knots. Too high or too slow, and the engine will not spool up. The flame stays dead, and the aircraft remains a glider. Yet even within that envelope, restarting an engine is not automatic. The crew must follow a precise sequence, cut the fuel, crank the starter, and reignite at the right moment. One miscalculation, and the relight fails. That is why pilots train for this scenario again and again. In 2019, a Southwest Airlines 737 struck birds at LaGuardia and lost an engine. The crew descended into the relight envelope, followed the procedure, and the engine roared back to life. The flight landed safely. A flameout, yes, but not the end. How do pilots turn a powerless glide back into powered flight? The answer lies in the relight envelope, a narrow window of altitude and airspeed where a restart is possible. On the Hudson, Sullenberger had no time for a relight. His only option was the river. But for BA Flight 9, that window was their salvation, via air. And that is why procedures like ETOPS exist, to ensure that even over oceans, a flameout does not mean disaster. Every ETOPS certified aircraft must prove its engines can relight reliably. The Hudson and BA Flight 9 are not just stories. They are the reason modern aviation is safer. The flameout is no longer the end. It is a test of training. But there is another threat that can cause a flameout without a single bird or grain of ash. Ice. Ice crystals can form inside the fuel tanks at high altitude, clogging filters and starving the engines of fuel. In 2008, a British Airways 777 crashed short of Heathrow because ice in the fuel clogged the flow. Both engines lost power simultaneously, a rare dual flameout from a source no one had suspected, which is why modern aircraft have fuel heaters that prevent ice formation. But if the heater fails or the crew forgets to activate it, ice can still form. The lesson: even invisible threats must be managed. So flameouts are rarely random. They follow patterns. Birds, ash, ice, fuel mismanagement. Each has a predictable cause and a procedure. The real challenge is human: staying calm, following the checklist, and trusting the training. In the BA Flight 9 incident, the crew initially thought they had a fuel problem. Only by following the engine failure checklist did they discover the ash. Checklists are not bureaucracy. They are survival tools. And when all else fails, the aircraft itself has one last trick: the auxiliary power unit. This small turbine in the tail can provide electrical power and even restart engines in flight. A backup that has saved countless lives. But there is another threat that can cause a flameout without a single bird or grain of ash. Ice. Ice crystals can form inside the fuel tanks at high altitude, clogging filters and starving the engines of fuel. In 2008, a British Airways 777 crashed short of Heathrow because ice in the fuel clogged the flow. Both engines lost power simultaneously, a rare dual flameout from a source no one had suspected. Which is why modern aircraft have fuel heaters that prevent ice formation. But if the heater fails, or the crew forgets to activate it, ice can still form. The lesson: even invisible threats must be managed. And so each time you board a plane, you are protected by decades of lessons learned from flameouts past. Better engines now detect ash before it vitrifies, and pilots train relentlessly for the relight. The silence of a stalled engine is no longer a death sentence. It is a problem with a solution, waiting for the right hands to bring it back to life.